Yeah, so my session today is going to be on political theory and climate change. The session is more about how to start thinking about climate change in terms of political theory. I don't really present any explicit political theories. Maybe that will be the concept for another webinar. Yeah, so this is a brief summary. So the first thing I'm going to broach is defining climate change. And the reason for this is that a lot of the papers that I've written are very loose with what they mean by climate change. Often it intersects with ideas of environment, which for me is just problematic for the theory, but I'll broach that in this section. Two broad approaches to thinking about climate change. There are two broad approaches. Of course, it is a spectrum, but on either end there are these approaches, and they're quite important if you're going to start thinking of what position, what viewpoint you take on approaching climate change. My third one is climate change and political theory. That's mostly looking at, is climate change a challenge for political theory? Do we need new political theories, or can we integrate it into existing political theories? And then briefly, I'll talk a little bit about my own work on climate change and social contract theory. The way that I decided to structure this is really through a series of questions that I asked myself when I started to look at the subject. I just found this was the easiest way to do this, and I hope that suits everyone. So yeah, so defining climate change. One of the questions is, what is climate change? And then the second question is, how is climate change different to environmental change? Why is it important to distinguish between, can someone tell me if the screen is fully cut off for them, or is it just for me?
It's cut off.
Yeah, okay, one sec, let me fix that. Right, this is in the way. No, hopefully that's a little bit better. Yeah, no, it's still cut off.
Maybe just exit the full screen.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, sorry, you have to see my very messy dashboard now rather than a full screen. Okay, yeah, I'll just keep going. So the questions here is, what is climate change? How is climate change different to environmental change? This is quite an important distinction, I think. And then this kind of sub questions there is, why is it important to distinguish between climate change and environmental change? And what impact does this have on the questions we need to ask in political theory and climate change? So my first question is, what is climate change? This is really looking at the actual definitions of climate change that exist across not just science, but also the kind of more important international conventions and frameworks. So the IPCC definition of climate, they have two ones, which is their narrow definition is the average weather over a period of time. The broad definition is the state of the climate system. The climate system is usually what we're talking about. When most people think about climate change, they usually do think about extreme weather patterns. But changes in the climate system, although they manifest largely in weather patterns, are far more complex. And I think this is an element of climate change that a lot of people in political science and social science don't elaborate enough on. So the climate system has got 5 major components, and it consists of the interaction between these components as well. So it's the atmosphere, which is the gases surrounding the Earth, hydrosphere, which is liquid water on our planet, cryosphere, which is frozen water on our planet, so ice, Lithosphere is I think the crust of the Earth and the upper part of the mantle, and then the biosphere and ecosphere, which is largely what we are concerned with most of the time, which is the kind of the sphere in which all things live, or living organisms inhabit. The most important thing about climate change is that climate is affected by its own internal dynamics. This is a point that a lot of people get a bit confused on. You'll hear it in a lot of climate deniers saying that it's a natural process, which is technically true to an extent. So it is affected by its own internal dynamics, but there's also external forcings, which can be natural or anthropogenic. So then onto climate change. Again, this comes from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If people aren't sure what the acronym is, this comes from their 5th assessment report. So they define climate change as a change in the state of the climate that can be identified in the mean and/or variability of properties that persist over time. Where this now kind of actually comes into how we should start thinking about political theory is that we need to make this distinction between the drivers of climate change. So there are natural drivers, which are the internal dynamics of the climate system, or external natural forcings, driving short or long-term change. So long-term change is what we can think about as changes, say, between the Ice Age and the modern era. And then short-term could be things like a volcano erupts, and this temporarily disrupts the climate system in the region. What we're primarily concerned with, and what most people mean when they talk about climate change, is when they talk about anthropogenic drivers, which are external forcings as a direct or indirect result of human activity. And the IPCC defines this as persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of the atmosphere and land use. So land use is pretty much how we use the land. And then changes in the atmosphere and the composition of the atmosphere have to do with the emission of greenhouse gases. My definition of climate change comes from the IPCC, but I think the UNFCCC say it a little bit more clearly in Article 1, where they say change in climate, which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere. And this is, for me, quite important and quite a theoretical point that should be stressed, that is missing in quite a lot of the literature, which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So why they say is in addition is because a lot of the time we assume almost a type of consistency, where there is a natural variability in climate. Things do change, but what we are talking about is rapidly accelerated changes due to human activity, which is obviously quite a mouthful, so most people just use climate change. But to make it very clear, what I talk about is specifically climate change as a result of human activity. Now, one of the points as well that is particularly important and tends to get muddled a little bit in the literature, in my opinion, is the difference between climate change and environmental change. So first we need to define the natural environment. So the natural environment is the surrounding conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives and operates, or the natural world as a whole in particular geographic area. Natural environmental change is a change or disturbance of the natural environment. So climate change obviously plays a huge part in environmental change, but in terms of creating a theory, I think it is definitely more useful to think about it as its own distinct phenomenon. I'll discuss why they raise different questions, but right now it's just important to say that it's distinguishing between environmental and climate change really changes what questions you ask. Yeah, so here it is. So what is important to distinguish between climate change and environmental change? My main theory is that different processes result in different policies. So here we have mitigation and adaptation, which are two words that are quite common in the climate change literature and also the policy and the science. Driver policies focus on emission reductions. So they can be shift to renewable, non-renewable, or designing of electric cars or energy efficient buildings. They also have efforts to remove existing greenhouse gases. So these are carbon capture and storage technologies, and also using natural carbon sinks. These mitigation questions are complicated in terms of political theory. I'll move on to them a little bit later. Climate change adaptation policies, they can largely be approached from a justice and ethics perspective. Adaptation is basically making sure that the effects of climate change aren't highly detrimental. They're usually focused in kind of more vulnerable states in developing countries, but you'll see a lot of developed countries now. The Netherlands is a perfect example, are actually putting in place adaptation policies. So they include disaster risk reduction, climate resilient practices, pathways for human movement, which is migration. That's a field that I work in quite a lot. And also socioeconomic policies and diversifying economies. Yeah, so environmental change. Driver policies are usually about stopping harmful practices or putting environmental safety checks in place. So these can be international conventions, regulations, or so regulations, say, on the transport of hazardous material or on waste management. Impact policies are usually focused on conservation and or restoration. So that can be rewilding, reintroducing native species back to an area that maybe lost their biodiversity, and or introducing new species that are known to have positive environmental effects. So this is probably the part that's a little bit more relevant to political theory. So it's important to distinguish between climate change and environmental change, because different processes mean different policies. So what I usually say is creating policy means asking questions: what problem needs to be solved, what's needed to solve these problems, and how to solve these problems without negative impacts on other policy areas. This is an area of policy studies that I think really intersects with political theory, because political theory is largely asking questions. So my conclusion here is different processes, different policies, different questions. So what impact does this distinction between climate change and environment have on our political theory? What questions we need to ask when it comes to political theory of climate change? Sorry, I realize I have a giant finish there. So yeah, both entail normative questions and inquiry. But what is supposed to be there is that their focus is slightly different. So with the environmental questions, we usually ask, what is the relationship between humans and nature? Do non-human species have equal value to humans? Do natures have intrinsic value in itself? Do humans have a responsibility to protect nature? They are normative questions and they are ethical questions, but a lot of it, I believe, relates a lot more to these kind of larger meta questions that can be seen in political theory and political philosophy. Climate change questions tend to be a lot more specific to policy and practice. We do have normative questions in there, such as, do we have a responsibility to other human beings? Do we have a responsibility to people outside of our own nation? Can someone be morally responsible for climate change or ethically responsible to climate change? And then this feeds into questions of responsibility. So you can see here that these climate change questions really do tend to be a lot more focused on what I would call practice rather than theory, but they are still important to ask. So one of the ways that I started to look at political theory and climate change, this was something that I was taught in my master's, is the different ways that climate change can be approached. Generally, we have two broad streams of thinking. They're based on concepts of instrumentalism and intrinsic value. They're anthropocentric and ecocentric. Anthropocentric is human-focused. It sees nature valuable in that it is instrumental, so that means it produces benefits for humans. They largely believe that the human world is separate to the natural world, And they have a human-centered value system, which means humans are the primary object of value. So nature only has value in that it contributes to the value of humans. Ecocentrism means nature is intrinsically valuable. It means it's something that's valuable within itself. They believe that humans are actually integrated into the natural system. So in that way, there's no primary object of value. There are extremes of this. It gets to a point where people are very anti-speciesism or almost overly favoritism of nature and non-human species, but that's more in practice than in actual theory. So the two broad streams, they do pose different questions, but they also pose different ways of answering questions. So anthropocenic questions are largely focused on humans. So they can talk about, I have a few examples here. Do humans have a responsibility to one another to mitigate climate change? How much of a responsibility? Do humans have a responsibility to future generations to mitigate climate change? This is also called intergenerational justice. Do humans have a responsibility to persons in vulnerable countries to assist with climate change adaptation, and how much of a responsibility? These are questions that we see come up a lot in policy forums and debates, which is why I said that climate change questions tend to very much be focused on more practical questions, but they can be approached from a theoretical standpoint, and they do encompass a lot of the ideas that we have in political theory, such as, like as distributed justice or ethical and moral responsibility. Ecocentric questions, again, they relate a lot to what a lot of literature is already talking about in terms of environmental ethics. So what responsibility to other species do humans have to mitigate climate change? And that's largely the human nature relationship question that's quite prominent in ecologism, which is a form of political theory focused on environmental matters. And what responsibility do humans have to restore the natural environment and clean the atmosphere? It's important to say that that responsibility isn't necessarily to other humans or other species, but it is just more of a meta question on can there potentially be, or really is there a responsibility to nature? Can nature have a person? Can nature have an agency? So one of the best ways I found to try and explain the different approaches would be looking at, say, a question. So how should climate change be approached and why? The anthropogenic approach, the human-based approach, said it should be approached in a way that doesn't negatively impact human systems. Largely we hear of economic systems, but also social systems. If you do believe in emission reductions, people will say that the emissions should be reduced to a level where climate change is slowed down, but our current economic system can continue. Or they'll say climate change should be tackled because we need the planet to survive as a human species. It's very important, again, that is an element of speciesism that's quite common in anthropocenic approaches. Ecocentric approaches would answer that question of how climate change should be mitigated, would be to say that it should be approached in a way that prioritizes nature and the restoration of the global environmental climate system. Emissions should be reduced to an absolute minimum level, even if that means economic degrowth. And their concept of why climate change should be mitigated would be based on the idea that we have a responsibility to the survival of other species, given that the rapid acceleration of climate change is largely due to our activity. When looking at climate change and political theory, there's a lot of debate over whether climate change really can be integrated or should be approached from a political theory standpoint. So one of the questions that I really started to ask myself when I started to do my master's and took a more natural science approach was, can climate change be integrated into existing political theory, or do we need a new political theory of climate change? One of the main ideas is, does climate change pose a challenge to political theory? And one of the questions that I regularly get asked, which is why I included in here, is, does political theory actually apply to climate change as a phenomenon? And one of the reasons that people use is that climate change is a scientific phenomenon. It's not a political one. They argue that we have empirical scientific reasons why climate change is occurring. My answer to that is usually we don't have specific answers to why humans have continued to act against their own survival. Remember, like we do have empirical scientific reasons why climate change is occurring, but this is really a rational choice here, whether we choose to survive as a species or not. And for some reason, we are not choosing to survive, which we would think is one of the basic tenets of human nature. And I argue this is largely to do with politics. A lot of people say that we have a way to stop climate change. We just need to reduce our emissions. So we don't need political theory, because we don't need a theory. We have a concrete answer as how to stop this. Again, I've argued that we haven't made significant progress and we continue to produce emissions because climate action requires policy changes which are political. It's not sufficient for people to merely make their own choice. The fact is we do live in a political system that requires policy shifts, which are generally quite highly debated. Another one that I've heard would be that climate change is a modern phenomenon. So the question here would be, can existing prominent political theory traditions meaningfully engage with climate change? So a lot of the kind of people who do not want climate change integrated into political theory will say that the kind of more prominent political theories did not or could not have envisioned a phenomenon like climate change, therefore we need a new political theory. I would argue that many of the questions we ask are the exact same, regardless of the historic or modern context. If you believe that climate change is a governing the global commons issue, that's one of the fundamental tenets of political theory. If you believe that mitigating climate change is a matter of justice, particularly distributed justice, owing to the fact that Western liberal countries have disproportionately contributed to the effects of climate change, but disproportionately feel the impacts of climate change, then we're still talking about the same questions that we've been talking about in political philosophy really since it began. This is one of my favorite questions. I've talked to a lot of people about it. I come from a Western liberal political theory tradition, so I didn't want to elaborate too much on this, but it's definitely an important area of inquiry, where climate change is an effect of Western liberal social and economic ideologies. So one of the questions that a lot of people are talking about in the literature now is, can existing or prominent political theory traditions, which are largely Western liberal traditions, meaningfully engage with climate change if they're based in the Western liberal tradition? This is one of the questions that is incredibly difficult to answer. It's also very important for me to preface that I do come from Western liberal tradition, and that's what I'm talking about. There are many amazing theories around indigenous theories. I know there's some theories in African political thought. Even some feminist ecology positions are definitely moving away from this and actually don't like to use notions of social contract theory, which is what I work in mostly. They will not use them. Yeah. So then to approach the question, do we need a new political theory of climate change? This is probably something that we could discuss towards the end as a group, but I would argue no from my own personal position. But I do want to mention that there is a new school of political thinking and theory called green political thought. I don't really see it as a new school. Proponents of it argue that they combine normative and empirical scientific elements relating to climate change and larger questions of human nature relationship. Except from a lot of my reading, as I mentioned, we're still asking the same fundamental questions that we've asked throughout political theory. Maybe the difference is that they use a lot of empirical scientific work, but I believe that that could be integrated into any political theory once you took political theory out of the theoretical elements and tried to make it into a practical application. Yeah, so now this is closer to my theory and my work. It's very much a very brief summary. Maybe I'll share this on another webinar sometime. So one of the questions that I've been asking is, can we reform the social contract to include climate change mitigation? I focus largely on social contract theory because I think it's one of the better explanations of how societies continue to, for lack of a better word, consent to ongoing authority, even if it's not working out in their interests in the same way. So another reason why I chose social contract theory is, I'm sure a lot of you know, we hear quite a lot on the international stage, and also I'm sure in a lot of your countries, a lot of political statements saying we need a new social contract. But very rarely do those people saying we need a new social contract explain what it means. So in theory, the social contract is a historic or hypothetical agreement that humans entered into in order to exit the state of nature. The state of nature being akin to a state of anarchy that was not conducive to producing positive benefits for humankind, so they decided to come and live in groups or communities. Broadly, the idea is that the agreement gives legitimacy to a political authority or sovereign, depending on if you're in the Hobbes-Locke tradition, as humans consented to give up some of their autonomy in order to live in a society which produced benefits. And this is really important to say, it's a hypothetical agreement. So in practice, the concept of a social contract is highly disputed because of the notion of consent. No one currently living has explicitly consented to a historic or hypothetical contract. You know, you don't sign a contract at your moment of birth saying that you consent to being in the society that you live in. So that's where we need to get the split between explicit and tacit consent. So the solution for most contractarians, I focus primarily on Locke, is that the notion of tacit consent is what allows the social contracts to remain valid or legitimate. And the argument is that tacit consent is inferred from the allowing of parties in the contract to allow the contract to continue to exist and to continue to benefit from it. So really, it's not saying, yes, I agree, but just not outwardly stating that you disagree. And one of the main arguments here is that you continue to benefit from the social contract. So you continue to benefit from living in society. Why I choose social contract theory is that I really believe there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between the concept of being born in a society with an existing social contract, as per the theory, and also being born into a system with an existing structural system. In most of my work, I call this the modern structural system. What this means is generally the system of capitalist economics that have largely led to a huge amount of the emissions that we've seen that are causing climate change. My argument is that modern societies have inherited the structural system, which mediates their relationship with nature in the same way social contracts are inherited in contract theory. The idea that we have a mediated relationship with nature it goes back to that anthropocenic idea that humans are separate from nature, that there's the human world and the natural world. And we'll see a lot of the time, if you look at policies, if you look at the way that like societies are set up, it's very much, they talk about the natural world as something very separate to the human world. So it's important when you are looking at kind of updating, I guess, the social contract, is that rather than being in the state of nature, the modern structural system, which again is the economic system, uses economic property as a justifying basis. So the idea is that rather than you stay in a social contract as per Locke's theory because it gives you security and survival, you stay in this modern structural system because it gives you economic prosperity. And why I've used this kind of idea of economic property as a justifying basis comes from when we hear a lot of the political opposition to climate action. A lot of it is justified using economic considerations. Oh, we can't switch to renewable energy because so many people will lose their jobs, or it's too expensive to use this technology rather than a high emission technology. So either their political opposition, direct political opposition, is based on economic considerations, or political leaders have used the concept of economics and degrowth as a way of justifying constraints that they set on policies. So for me, how to adapt the social contract to allow for climate change considerations. The argument for Locke is that tacit consent was given to governments because one uses and enjoys a country's amenities. So again, this goes back to the idea that we are particularly, again, I'm talking about Western liberal societies, developed societies, high pollution societies. We enjoy the economic prosperity that we get from the use of high emission technology and an economy that has largely historically been based on fossil fuels. So in order to adapt this concept of tacit consent for modern society from Locke, the amenities that he envisioned was security and social order. Now we can figure that to the idea of wealth and economic prosperity. And a note on quickly why I use wealth and economic prosperity is actually a lot of the time because we do split our worlds into the idea of wealthy and non-wealthy. We talk about high income, low income countries, developed countries, developing countries. We're always talking in terms of economic I guess perspectives, and then we also use GDP usually as an indicator of growth. So we are very much economically focused. I know a lot of people who maybe work in the area of climate change wouldn't like to have that focus on economics, except I think it's just a feature of the system that we're already living in. So I argue now that tacit consent is the enjoyment of a Western modern lifestyle. And because we continue to enjoy it, that signals consent to the continuation of the modern structural system that is largely contributing to climate change. A lot of critics of Locke say that enjoyment is not sufficient to signal consent. I do agree with that, which is why I've had to change the concept of tacit consent a little bit. So my argument here is that enjoyment is not sufficient to signal consent, as persons living in the modern structural system were born into the system, and therefore their actions are shaped and constrained by this system. So what this means is that people are not freely undertaking action. They were born into a system. They maybe don't know any better. You know, you're tacitly consenting to a system when you go into a public area and you have streetlights. All these tiny little structural things that we don't think about, that signals tacit consent in this broader framework. So the question then to ask is, how can tacit consent to the continuation of the system be conceptualized? So I took legal theory here, where tacit consent is inferred from the silence of a party when presented with the opportunity to refuse or reject a proposal. It's not directly expressed through an agreement to an action, but it is inferred from the allowance of the continuation of an action without interference. The main problem comes with this idea that tacit consent in legal theory must be voluntary and free from coercion. But if you were born into a system with a set of practices, your actions are shaped and constrained by the system. It's not possible for you to become entirely divorced from capitalism if you're living in a capitalist society. So how much consent can be said to be voluntary and free from coercion is highly questionable. That led me to my conceptualization that tacit consent is defined as a failure to act when a certain response from individuals is required. So this changes tacit consent away from a very passive notion to the idea that something is happening and we have a responsibility as a society to object and to change that. This largely was informed by Locke's right to resist, which was in his social contract theory, which is the idea that if the sovereign is going awry or is producing very negative effects for your society, it's not that you only have a right to revolt and change your sovereign, but you actually have a responsibility. And I think this is one of the most important points for my theory of social contract when you try to bring in climate change considerations, is that tacit consent is no longer passive when you are presented with an outcome that is inherently negative and you continue to allow it to happen. So this would be catastrophic climate change. And as we know, a lot of people will say that it's very extreme rhetoric, but we know we're entering into an age of extinction. We know what's happening. We can see what's happening to other people all around the world who are losing their lives every day to climate change. So this is where I would say that tacit consent comes in that we, especially in Western liberal societies, are consenting to this because we're not doing enough to change it. It can be disputed and debated, and it has been by a lot of colleagues of mine. People are out protesting, maybe they're changing their lifestyles, it requires a system. This is a very individual look at social contract, the idea that every single person individually consents and signs. I don't take this view, I look at it very holistically. And yeah, my argument is basically that people continue to tacitly consent because not enough is being done, not enough pressure is being done. If people really wanted climate action, they would be able to vote in people who did climate action, but it's just not happening. Yeah. So this is coming towards the end of it. So this is how to reform the social contract to allow for climate action. This would be something that I would hope to present in maybe another seminar. The reason I presented social contract is just because I'm used to it, but also to show that one of the fundamental tenets of Western liberal political theory can actually really be used quite well to accommodate climate change and climate change action. So my argument is that meaningful action on climate change requires a change, not just in what we do or how we do it, but also why we do it. So I argue here that we need normative ethical inquiry that can address why. So if you think back to when I talked about climate change being a scientific phenomena, so people say that there isn't any space for political theory. There is space for political theory. We need to be asking why. Why are we continuing to allow a system that we know is highly detrimental to other people and eventually will lead to, if not an extinction of the human race, a very, very, very dire impact on our race. So I would hope to present that another time. Again, I suggested a potential follow-up seminar, reforming the social contract through environmental ethics, the value of normative ethical discourse in addressing why. I've left up, that's the abstract from a paper that I wrote that I'm in the middle of actually extending a little bit more because it was quite short. Yeah, so if you're interested in that paper, or if you're interested in doing an actual, maybe a bit more of an in-depth seminar on social contract and theory and climate change, maybe in the second round, I'll consider that. And now if anyone has any particular questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I think I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, regarding the matter of tacit consent.
Yeah.
Doesn't your version to exclude just so many factors that we would usually, you know, if we were talking about the consent of an individual, be included in that question, in the definition of that person's even just tacit consent. For instance, just knowing about what happens. You know, every single part of climate change is constantly being questioned in its relation to a global climate change, in its actual happening in the age of fake news and alternative facts. Knowing that it's systemic is yet another matter. It kind of presupposes that you have knowledge of, for instance, political theory, or at least some kind of educational background that makes you conceptualize these matters in like a political, systemic fashion, instead of just things that happen naturally. Knowing about systemic alternatives as well. So yeah, that, like, even fathoming that is, I believe, a big hurdle here. And then I think the matter of tacit consent also abstracts from individuals in a problematic matter towards the consent of societies. For instance, Joe Biden was just elected president, but he likely won't act on climate change in any sweeping way. On the one hand, because of the Senate, well, if they don't get the Senate, no, not Mitch McConnell. The Senate will be able to block any policy he would want, and also he's not a climate president. He's the not Trump president, and that's why he was elected by many of those people who really want sweeping climate legislation, but they won't get it, and their priority had to be here to vote Trump out of office. But that still isn't any kind of tacit consent, at least not from those segments of the American population, to return to climate policy like in the era of Obama. You know, so there's a problem there, and obviously it doesn't really fit that well into contract theory, because everything kind of has to be tacit and implicit. Yes, but well, there's a whole democratic process, a very complicated legitimization process in reality there. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of this is the one thing that I was trying to emphasize with there's there's a lot of tension between climate change, climate politics, and political theory, because once you try to put a theory into kind of concrete action, of course you're going to come up with all these kind of bits and pieces. You need generalizations. In terms of the having knowledge and having education, I think, yeah, maybe to understand the actual processes and to maybe be able to present policy opportunities or alternative ways of dealing with climate change, you might need to have that. But I think when it's, well, we're on, I think it's 99.7% of scientists are saying now that it's caused, well, one, that it's real, that I feel sad that I have to say that, and two, that it is directly linked to human activity, primarily the emissions of greenhouse gases. I think that's not difficult to comprehend. When you get into all the tiny details, yes, but the fact is that if you believe in science and you have pretty much the whole scientific community in the world telling you that this is real, you don't need a high level of education to understand that. I don't need a medical degree to believe what my doctor tells me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that if has really gained in size, hasn't it? Like, that's a really big if you believe in science.
That's the problem. So that's where the theory does really rely on people actually recognizing it and believing it. Whether or not people choose to believe or not believe isn't necessarily my concern in this, because I talk about normative ethical inquiry And you're not going to take normative ethical inquiry if you don't believe it's real. And actually, the proportion of people who don't believe climate change is real it's bigger than it should be, but it's disproportionately reported because it's sensational and people like to listen to it. Like, you know, I've been to stuff by the Heartland Institute, and it always looks massive on social media, and then realistically it's like 20 older rich people sitting in a room talking about how they don't like liberal feminists. You know what I mean? It's very hyper over-reported because it's sensationalist.
Yeah, you know? like gun law in the States.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really sensationalist. Yeah, and it. Oh, fuck's sake. Ollie. Sorry. Ollie. Can you get the door, please? Sorry. Co-working is not the best. Yeah. Sorry, guys.
I'm not sure if anyone else has got questions, but maybe you can later jog my memory by going through the slides again. But I'm sure everybody else still has things.
Yeah, one of the reasons, just like, you know, the way I laid it out this way was because when I first started taking kind of modules over here, and I ended up talking to a lot of students, a lot of people were asking me how you can actually integrate climate change into political theory. So if you don't have questions on the kind of the brief outline of the social contract idea that I propose, if you have general questions on how political theory and climate change can relate, I can hopefully answer some of those as well. So I have it on the summary. So there's the definitions, the anthropogenic and ecocentric approach, challenges that climate change might have to political theory, and if political theory is suitable to deal with issues of climate change, and then also my own little bit of social contract theory as an introduction to what I might possibly do as my next webinar.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take social contract in a more general sense, general understanding, because of the special nature of climate change as a global common goods, then we actually can perceive 3 layers of social contract. The most obvious one is between the country state, the state and the people, the citizens. And second layer can be among different states. Then third layer will be between human species and nature. So if we see social contract in these 3 layers, like how do you think this is something relevant or something that you have any thoughts or opinions on?
Yeah, I find it difficult sometimes to relegate the notion that you have a social contract maybe between nations or at an international level. Because in one way, the whole idea is that all of humanity entered into this agreement to exit the state of nature. You know, when the contractarians were laying out the idea of leaving the state of nature, they didn't particularly pinpoint a particular nation. They were saying that it was the idea that all of humanity did this. And I guess if you want to talk about a global social contract theory, my argument would be that people have the responsibility to other people, not based on nation or any specific characterization, but by, maybe this is a little bit specious, but by nature of just being human. So for me, if you want to talk about a global contract, global social contract, it's purely got to do with being human. I don't really see it as necessarily being segregated between that. This is my opinion. I know those 3 layers, but I find that especially when it comes to, if you're looking at climate change, it's highly complicated to try and look at, is there a relationship between nations? Are some people more responsible to specific countries than others? Yeah.
On the matter of speciesism, that just reminded me, talking as an anti-speciesist, I just wanted to interject that really, I personally wouldn't mind the anthropocentric approach to some issues as much. I mean, there's obviously always a lot of dogmatism involved in these debates.
Yeah.
But after all, there needs to be something of a beholder to make things matter in the way we are talking about them in political theory. And like it or not, so far there has been us humans. So
yeah.
We really can only talk about these things in human terms. And I mean, or you could phrase it differently and say anthropocentric is kind of a kind of extreme way of putting it. It's just things matter to us, including animals, in a human way, you know. Yeah.
I think it's definitely a spectrum. I've read a lot of papers that say you have to take one approach or the other. I don't really believe so. I think that you can believe that we have responsibilities. We maybe have larger responsibilities to other humans than non-human species, but that doesn't mean that you completely relegate the importance of other species. So I think it's definitely a spectrum. And yeah, you can have it to the extreme ends. Like you can have the extreme ecocentric, where they're the people who believe that humans should just not be on the earth anymore, and that's the only way to save nature. You have those dogmatists, and then you have the extremes at the anthropocenic who say that we shouldn't do anything against climate change at all if it's going to have any effect on the human population.
Yeah.
Which it is going to have an economic impact that's unavoidable. So yeah, there's that. It's a spectrum, and I think that's not elaborated enough in a lot of the kind of literature that I read.
Yeah, but then again, anti-speciesist positions are so few and far between anyways, that like really it's kind of special that you included them here. Because
yeah.
I don't think a lot of people would have seen this, including myself. Like I'm not used to you know, anti-speciesism being regarded even in these discussions. So. No.
Yeah, I think it's important because if you view the earth as purely instrumental and nature as purely instrumental, that's what got us here. That's what got us to this idea that we could just use whatever we wanted to progress human society. You have to believe that nature has some value within itself. I guess there's also sometimes the anthropocenic, ecocentric view, like it's like this mix that, okay, we can do all these, nature is valuable and we should leave it alone, but because it benefits us. But I think if you don't believe that things have an inherent value within themselves, it just opens them up to exploitation. What's going to happen during the next, like look at the amount of countries saying that they're going to have a gas-led recovery. Once we drop in our economic position, if we don't believe that something has value in itself and we purely see it as instrumental, the minute that we go through any sort of hardships, we'll just revert back to this sort of self-sustaining behavior.
Couldn't I see a purely egoistic value in nature and my surroundings, wanting to use them instrumentally and therefore just wanting to stop climate change because like you said, there will be economic repercussions. Like, isn't that enough to oppose exploitation? Like, I don't think that, hey, I have to see an inherent value in anything or anyone really to favor anti-climate change policies or to, you know, because, well, if you say inherent value, that just makes me think of I'm not getting the word right now.
Yeah.
The thing Marx had a problem with.
Yeah.
There were so many. I'll get back to you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Essentialism.
Yeah.
That's what it is. like seeing inherent value in humans or other parts of nature, isn't that essentialist? Like we can be deontological and still be environment centrist, for instance.
Yeah,
to just
I think people can hold a plurality of views, and that this is why climate change is so complicated. Because it's not just something that's happening for nature. You know, it requires almost a complete systemic reconfiguration of everything that we know. So yeah, people do hold a plurality of views. My personal opinion, from what I've kind of been looking at, is that if you don't believe that something has value within itself, it makes it a lot easier to exploit. So a lot of times when I was talking to some people who were talking about nature having intrinsic value, said, but why do you think we have human rights? We don't have human rights because of all these practical reasons. You have human rights because you believe that human has a value in themselves by virtue of being human. Now, obviously, we know that human rights is not particularly popular all across the world, and there's still violations. But for me, I think once we see something as having value within itself, rather than purely for our own instrumental purposes, it will boost, or at least strengthen, ability to take action on climate change, and then also nature conservation.
So is that an empirical argument, as in most people will have to believe in some kind of inherent value to really value it and to deter exploitation, or is it that even theoretically there could be no other means of mode of thinking than that of inherent values that can deter exploitation?
From my kind of education and then also some kind of experience in this field is that I think, you know, a lot of people talk about rational choice. I don't necessarily believe in rational choice theory, because why are we choosing to actively contribute to our extinction? Sorry for the extreme rhetoric, but you know, this is really what's going on. And so for me, I think humans are very emotional. We like things told through stories. We like meanings. So one of the ways that I've found when I've been doing some kind of canvas and some policy working is that actually giving people inherent meanings and making somewhere valuable within itself is actually contributed to more sustained action. And one of the examples is in Australia, where they have decided to switch a lot of the names that usually there's a lot of extraction sites in. They switched them back to the First Nations names, so their actual names, and people started to learn all the stories and learn why this place was important. And it became not instrumental, because if it was purely instrumental, then it would be valuable because of the natural resources that they could extract there. And a lot of climate action actually became a lot more sustained, especially in communities who were quite opposed to it because they wanted the resource. But when you gave them meaning, it gave people pride in place, and they started to see it as valuable in itself rather than valuable just for their own economic purposes.
You'll definitely have to give those sources to me, please, because that matter of meaning, fostering collective action and fostering action in general, that's kind of my current project for my dissertation. And it's also the reason why I was roasting you this much on the question of inherent value, because I'm constantly engaged with that question. So yeah, I'll get back to you about that, because that is a great source for me.
Yeah, I'll have a look. I'll have to go back through my I went through this in Australia with a few policy groups, and then also in a lecture or two. So I'll have a look. But yeah, it kind of goes away maybe a little bit from political theory, but yeah, it's pretty common in I do a lot of cultural geography as well in my course. And the idea of connection to place is inherently connected with environmental protection and sustained collective action. Is there any other questions?
Great. Thank
I
you,
do
Lisa.
have
If you
more
have
about-
other,
Oh, but it's late.
yeah, so maybe you can discuss this in the group. So anyway, thank you, Lisa, for this presentation. We're going to end today's webinar now. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Thanks, Lisa.